And then there was a guy that was in charge of what they call the new talent program, and he called me into his office the next day, and he said, "Sit down, kid." He always called me kid. He was about 4 years older than me.
That was before I did Blade Runner, which I think is probably the hardest job I ever had.
So I saw the rushes from yesterday. You're never going to make it in this business.
At 83, Harrison Ford has he finally named the 6 actors he absolutely couldn't stand working with, calling one co-star a total diva and another the most arrogant man I've ever met.
This person suddenly got annoyed at, people talking while we were shooting, which is bad.
After decades of tight-lipped professionalism, Ford just blew the lid off some of Hollywood's best-kept feuds, and the fallout could shake Tinseltown to its core. Their clash on Blade Runner in 1982 is the stuff of Hollywood horror stories. What should have been just another on-set disagreement spiraled into one of the ugliest and most psychologically brutal feuds of Ford's career. Insiders say it wasn't just tension, it was a full-on war of egos.
We had some really funny moments on the last day of shooting because we were 4 months ragged and we were finally finishing the film.
Sean Young, only in her early 20s, dove headfirst into her role as the replicant Rachel, refusing to break character on or off the set. She lived and breathed Rachel like a zealot, leaning on method acting to blur the line between herself and the role. Ford, meanwhile, had zero patience for that kind of theatrical self-indulgence. He's always been a no-nonsense craftsman. Do the job, hit your mark, and leave the emotional melodrama at the door. The collision of those two extremes turned the Blade Runner set into a psychological battlefield. Ford reportedly bristled at Young's antics, while she accused him of being cold, dismissive, and unwilling to meet her in the truth of the performance. The result? A toxic atmosphere that bled into the film itself, leaving scars on both actors and forever shaping Ford's distaste for method madness. For Harrison Ford, acting was supposed to be simple: clear boundaries, sharp direction, and a clean break between the role and real life. But that line blurred the second Sean Young decided to drag her character off the set and into every interaction with him. Instead of showing up as herself, she showed up as Rachel, cold, cryptic, and emotionally locked down.
We're both in the spinner and we're driving away, we're running away from all the danger, and we're both drinking beers. It's like the last shot. We're both...
Even Ridley Scott later admitted the strangeness of it all. Sean lived in character continuously, which meant Harrison was never sure if he was talking to the actress or the replicant for Ford, who thrived on trust and human connection. This wasn't just eccentric, it was downright unsettling. What he signed up for was a film. What he got felt more like a psychological experiment where the lab rat was him. As shooting dragged on, the relationship didn't just sour, it rotted. Their so-called romantic scenes, which were supposed to drip with vulnerability and tension, became a nightmare. Cinematographer Jordan Cronenweth bluntly described it as the most awkward professional chemistry I've ever witnessed. There was no flow. Every moment was like pulling teeth.
I'm Rachel.
Deckard.
Ford's disdain was impossible to hide. He later admitted filming with Young felt like tiptoeing through a psychological minefield. Every glance, every touch laced with discomfort. And this wasn't just on camera. Even off set, Young refused to drop the act. Lunch breaks, hallway run-ins, casual conversations, all poisoned by her trance-like method energy. The pressure cooker boiled over. Crew members began picking sides, whispers rippled through the set, and the air grew so icy that Scott himself confessed the atmosphere could turn combative. What was supposed to be an iconic sci-fi romance was behind the scenes, closer to open warfare. There was never a shouting match.
You said, hardest job I've ever had.
I'll revise myself here and now and say that that was before I did Blade Runner, which I think is probably the hardest job I ever had.
No broken bottles, no public brawl, but the psychological toll of Harrison Ford and Sean Young's clash poisoned the entire Blade Runner shoot. Ford grew distant, retreating into himself, his interactions with Young clipped and cold. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, their partnership wasn't just strained, it was dead on arrival. The movie would later be hailed as a cult classic, but for the two leads, it was a nightmare best left buried. Ford, usually guarded in interviews, later dropped the mask and admitted the experience scarred ignored him. He confessed it reshaped the way he approached every co-star afterward, especially those who drowned themselves in immersive acting. "You want to believe in the story," Ford once said, "but you also want to know the people you're working with understand the difference between fiction and real life." For Sean Young, the fallout took a darker turn. Yes, her performance as Rachel was praised, but the rumors stuck, whispers of difficult behavior, diva antics, and a volatile personality that haunted her career for decades. In an industry run by powerful men, those labels weren't just unfair, they were career poison. Still, the Blade Runner chapter cemented her reputation as Hollywood's ultimate wild card and locked her feud with Ford into legend.
I would imagine that I thought that, yes, but not necessarily science fiction.
Yeah.
Science fiction adds a whole new dimension to filmmaking.
To this day, their clash stands as one of the most infamous behind-the-scenes Cold Wars in modern Hollywood. No closure, no reconciliation, just a frosty silence that turned a sci-fi masterpiece into a personal battlefield. And while that feud was burning in the 80s, Ford would later lock horns with another star, this time in the glittering, money-soaked Hollywood of the 1990s, Julia Roberts. On paper, it was a dream pairing, the gruff, brooding leading man and America's radiant sweetheart. Studios saw box office gold. What they got instead was oil and water. On paper, Harrison Ford and Julia Roberts looked like a license to print money. Two megastars at the height of their powers. Their names practically guaranteed box office domination. But what unfolded behind the scenes of their doomed romantic drama didn't just disappoint, it shocked even the most hardened Hollywood insiders. Instead of sparks, there was ice. Instead of passion, there was a creeping silence. The production collapsed under the weight of a spectacular personality clash that no amount of studio spin could disguise. The feud wasn't loud or tabloid-friendly. No screaming matches, no thrown chairs. It was quieter, subtler, and more corrosive. At its core, it was a battle of philosophies. Ford approached the project with his signature restraint, understated gestures, smoldering silence, the kind of performance where less is always more. Roberts, meanwhile, came in guns blazing, open, exuberant, and unapologetically expressive, the same qualities that had crowned her Hollywood sweetheart.
Have you ever worked with a guy who's just a raging maniac?
I did one time.
Put together, it wasn't balance. It was collision. Roberts wanted emotional firework. Ford gave her stone-faced silence. He thought she was too big. She thought he was practically sleepwalking. Director Mike Nichols, brought in to referee the chaos, summed it up bluntly. Julia's charm needs recognition and energy to bounce off. Harrison's strength is what he hides. They were like two instruments playing the same song in different keys. The breaking point came fast. Chemistry reads were a disaster. Early rehearsals only amplified the problem. Roberts would rise into wide-eyed emotional openness, while Ford would retreat further into minimalism. The result wasn't romantic tension. It was dead air. Hollywood expected a golden pairing. What they got was a catastrophic mismatch, a partnership so off-key, it killed the project before a single frame was shot. As the cameras rolled, key scenes that should have pulsed with instead landed like hollow echoes. On the page, the dialogue read electric, even sensual, but when played out between Julia Roberts and Harrison Ford, it became a collision of two incompatible acting philosophies. Roberts, all fire and instinct, poured herself into every line, waiting for a spark. Ford, disciplined to a fault, offered restraint so measured it veered into emotional vacancy.
This person suddenly got annoyed at, people talking while we were shooting, which is bad.
Script rewrites were ordered, rehearsals dragged late into the night, but nothing could close the chasm. What should have been passion came off like a mismatched duet, each performer playing a different song in a different key. Roberts' trademark warmth seemed to ricochet off Ford's granite stillness, leaving her increasingly vulnerable and exposed. Insiders whispered that Ford, uncomfortable with her larger-than-life energy, retreated further into himself, creating a wall of silence that bled into their performances. The breaking point came during the film's supposed emotional climax, a rain-soaked confession of love. Designed to simmer, crack, and finally ignite, the moment instead collapsed under its own weight. Roberts unleashed everything: tears, tremors, raw vulnerability, only to be met with Ford's distant, almost clinical delivery. The absence of chemistry was so total it became mesmerizing in its own way, cinematographer Spen Nivus later admitted. Crew members less less diplomatic, called it excruciating to watch. Roberts left set that night in tears, reportedly telling director Alan J. Nichols, "I feel like I'm acting into a void." Ford's private response was just as telling. In an uncharacteristic moment of candor, he confided to a producer, "I feel like I'm acting opposite a performance, not a person." For an actor famed for his quiet professionalism, it was a rare public crack in the armor, and a clear admission that the partnership had become toxic. But if Roberts represented a stylistic clash, Mel Gibson represented something far deeper. Of all the conflicts in Harrison Ford's career, none proved more explosive or more politically loaded than his refusal to work with Gibson. At the height of Gibson's box office dominance, studios salivated at the idea of pairing two megastars in a high-stakes action thriller. Contracts were floated, directors courted, money practically guaranteed, but Ford shut it down, quietly but firmly.
Then there was a guy that was in charge of what they called the new talent program, and he called me into his office the next day and he said, "Sit down, kid." He always called me kid. He was about 4 years older than me.
Industry whispers split into camps. Some called it professional rivalry. Others claimed Ford's dislike for Gibson's volatile on-set reputation. But those closer to the decision point to something heavier. Ford's refusal to overlook Gibson's increasingly controversial off-screen behavior years before the tabloids made it impossible to ignore. In an era when Hollywood still brushed off racism and volatility as eccentricities, Ford drew a line. "Character matters," one insider quoted him as saying, "on screen and off." The fallout was seismic. A would-be blockbuster evaporated overnight, and Gibson, furious at the snub, allegedly lobbied against Ford for years. The two men, one an icon of stoic moral steadiness, the other a powder keg of charisma and controversy, never shared the screen and likely never will. What might have been a box office juggernaut instead became a cautionary tale of Hollywood's moral crossroads, and a reminder that even in an industry built on illusion, sometimes what you refuse to do says more than any role you take. The rift between Harrison Ford and Mel Gibson wasn't born from some explosive shouting match on set. It was slower, subtler, and ultimately more devastating. A fracture that unfolded across years of almost collaborations, development meetings, and backroom studio pitches. By the late 1990s, Gibson was still one of Hollywood's brightest box office draws, but his off-screen turbulence had begun to overshadow his artistry. Ford, ever the disciplined professional, found himself staring down a choice: attach his name to a powder keg or walk away. On paper, the pairing was irresistible. Producers envisioned Ford and Gibson as dual titans headlining a Jerry Bruckheimer-backed espionage thriller, a global tentpole designed to dominate summer box offices. The money was on the table, the marketing practically wrote itself. America's rock-solid hero meets Hollywood's fearless firebrand. But from the very first table reads, it was clear to Ford that the two men weren't just clashing in performance style, they were colliding on a deeper moral level. Ford, defined by his stoic discipline and insistence on mutual respect, approached filmmaking as a craft rooted in collaboration. Gibson, meanwhile, had cultivated a reputation for volatility, both in his daring artistic instincts and in his increasingly unhinged public persona. What some admired as fearless authenticity, others, Ford chief among them, saw as recklessness bordering on toxicity.
Saw the rushes from yesterday. You're never going to make it in this business.
Insiders recall that the atmosphere around those early meetings was tense, even before cameras rolled. Gibson's name had already become synonymous with controversy, unpredictable interviews, erratic on-set behavior, and incendiary remarks that sent shockwaves through the industry. Harrison operates from a baseline of dignity and respect, Bruckheimer later admitted. With Mel, that baseline became impossible to maintain. The cracks widened when several high-profile supporting actors quietly pulled out of the project, unwilling to share a set with Gibson. For Ford, who valued ensemble trust above all else, it was the ultimate red flag. What good was a blockbuster if the crew itself was fractured before day one? The breaking point came behind closed doors, during a high-stakes studio meeting that some insiders now describe as one of the most principled standoffs in modern Hollywood history. Ford, usually a man of few words, laid it out with a clarity that stunned even executives. He would not, could not, in good conscience tie himself to a project where the atmosphere risked becoming unsafe or hostile because of one man's presence. "It's not about rivalry," Ford reportedly said. "It's about the environment we're creating. If people can't feel respected, we don't have a film." "We have a circus." It was an extraordinary move in a town where silence and complicity had long been the default, and it carried consequences. The would-be tentpole collapsed. Gibson, by some accounts, never forgave the slight grumbling privately that Ford had cost him one of the biggest paydays of his career. Industry veterans still speculate about the alternate universe where Ford looked the other way, swallowed his discomfort, and delivered a billion-dollar box office pairing. But Ford's refusal drew a different kind of respect. Quietly, it became a line in the sand about what Hollywood would tolerate, years before Gibson's scandals exploded publicly. The two men would never share a marquee, and likely never will. For some, it was a tragic what-if of blockbuster history. For others, it was Harrison Ford doing what Harrison Ford always did, playing the long game, protecting the work, and refusing to compromise the dignity of the set, even if it meant saying no to a gold-plated opportunity. It wasn't just about a paycheck or a role or even one film. It was about respect, ethics, and the fragile web of trust required to create meaningful art. He didn't raise his voice, one executive recalled of Ford's quiet but unwavering stand against Gibson. But it was the most forceful thing I've ever seen him do. He wasn't arguing about a line of dialogue or a lighting choice. He was drawing a moral line in the sand. The project unraveled soon after. Officially, the studio blamed creative delays and scheduling conflicts. But within industry circles, everyone knew the truth. Harrison Ford had walked away, and in doing so, he had sent a message louder than any press release. In an era when silence was the safer career move, Ford's refusal cut through the noise. He wasn't just rejecting a co-star, he was rejecting a culture of complicity.
I said, I thought you were supposed to think that that was a grocery delivery boy. He said, get out of my office.
Hollywood insiders still point to the moment as a symbolic turning point. Proof that star power didn't only come from the box office, it could come from principles. Gibson would stumble through his own very public downfall in the years that followed, clawing for redemption. But the ghost of that failed Ford-Gibson collaboration lingers as a reminder of what was lost and what was saved. For Ford, it was a moment of absolute clarity. Craft over commerce, character over convenience. It wasn't just a missed movie, it was a manifesto. And yet, moral conviction wasn't the only kind of friction that defined Ford's career. Sometimes the battles weren't about ethics, they were about artistry itself. Enter Tommy Lee Jones. The tension between Ford and Jones during the making of The Fugitive has since become Hollywood lore. Two powerhouse actors locked in a kind of creative Cold War. What audiences saw on screen, the cat and mouse electricity between Dr. Richard Kimball and U.S. Marshal Sam Gerard, was undeniably riveting. But behind the camera, the atmosphere was thick with strain.
One out of each and every one of you is a hard target search of every gas station.
Ford arrived on set as the consummate professional, the architect of performance. His process was meticulous, almost surgical. Character built piece by piece, scene by scene, like a house constructed brick by brick. Jones, by contrast, thrived on volatility. He was instinctive, sharp-edged, even combative in his method. Where Ford sought control, Jones thrived on chaos. Crew members later described the set as a battle of rhythms. Ford wanted precision, a careful build of tension. Jones wanted sparks, immediacy, and confrontation. Sometimes that contrast worked like alchemy. The chase scenes in particular crackle with an urgency born from their conflicting energies. But other times, it boiled over into outright friction. You never knew if you were watching a rehearsal or a duel, one assistant director recalled. Unlike the collapse with Roberts or the moral standoff with Gibson, Ford and Jones managed to channel their incompatibility into something extraordinary on screen. The respect was real, but it was laced with irritation, suspicion, and the constant push-pull of two men who refused to yield. What resulted was one of the most iconic cat-and-mouse thrillers in modern cinema, and a working relationship so fraught it was never repeated.
I don't give a damn whether it's the first or the second or the third biggest film of the summer. I want people to see the film to feel that they've gotten their money's worth.
For Ford, whose method relied on precision and consistency, Jones's improvisations weren't just artistic flourishes, they were disruptions. Every altered inflection, every unexpected pause, every swapped-out word forced Ford to abandon his carefully mapped emotional beats and react in real time. To some, that was the magic of cinema. To Ford, it was sabotage of the architecture he had so meticulously designed. The interrogation scene became ground zero for their creative clash. Ford wanted clarity, rhythm, and control. Jones wanted chaos, surprise, and immediacy. Crew members later recalled watching Ford's jaw tighten take after take as Jones toyed with delivery, shifting the energy energy of the scene like a musician riffing on a melody, while his bandmates stubbornly stuck to the sheet music. It was like watching oil and water fight to mix, one camera operator admitted. The tension deepened when Jones began to tweak scripted dialogue, not drastically, but enough to throw off Ford's prepared timing. A missed cue here, an unexpected emphasis there, and suddenly Ford's performance, which he had anchored to a consistent emotional progression, felt destabilized. For a man who prized discipline, it was infuriating. One assistant director put it bluntly, Harrison felt Tommy was playing jazz on a score he'd spent months memorizing. Andrew Davis, caught in the middle, tried to frame it as creative friction. Tommy changes the color of a scene every time we roll, he explained. It's thrilling, but it's dangerous, especially for someone like Harrison, who needs continuity to track his character's journey. In practice, that meant Davis had to shoot multiple versions of the same scene just to preserve usable material, a luxury that ballooned both the schedule and the budget. By mid-shoot, the atmosphere between the two men had grown icy. Ford, usually the embodiment of restrained professionalism, was openly frustrated, while Jones seemed to relish the disruption, leaning harder into his improvisational style. Crew members whispered about dueling performances, and some even took sides, those who admired Jones's spontaneity versus those who respected Ford's discipline. You could feel it in the air, one grip later recalled. Half the crew was betting on when Harrison would finally explode. The explosion never came, at least not publicly, but the hostility bled into subtle gestures, Ford retreating between takes, Jones mocking the rigidity of rehearsals, both men refusing to acknowledge each other off camera unless absolutely necessary. Their shared scenes sizzled with an intensity born less from collaboration than from combat. And ironically, it worked. The tension that made The Fugitive so electric on screen was the very same tension that made the set a powder keg behind the camera.
Been on the run for 90 minutes. Average foot speed over on.
Ford, known for his uncompromising respect for script integrity and the rhythm of collaboration, eventually stopped masking his frustrations. What began as quiet grumbles turned into heated debate. Crew members recall production grinding to a halt more than once as Ford and Jones locked horns over a question that went beyond dialogue. What did professional courtesy actually mean? Was spontaneity a mark of genius or a reckless dismantling of a co-star's foundation? Director Andrew Davis was left refereeing. I had two brilliant actors making two different movies, he later admitted. The tension between them was real, but that's what made the scenes pop. You didn't know what was going to happen, and neither did they. Nowhere was that tension more raw than in the film's most iconic moment, the tunnel confrontation. Kimball's desperate cry, "I didn't kill my wife," against Gerard's chillingly flat, "I don't care." On screen, it plays as pure lightning, two performances colliding with perfect, jagged force. But behind the camera, it was chaos. Jones's mercurial energy meant no two takes were alike. One moment, he was cold steel, the next sarcastic bravado, throwing Ford's carefully plotted emotional beats into disarray. At one point, the volatility pushed Ford over the edge. According to multiple crew accounts, he briefly walked off set, demanding the scene be locked for blocking and delivery. "I can't do my job if he keeps changing the ground under me," Ford reportedly snapped, his composure cracking in a rare show of exasperation. And yet, out of that strain came cinematic electricity. The mistrust, the irritation, the thinly veiled disdain between the actors seeped into their characters' relationship, giving The Fugitive an edge no director could have manufactured. Ford's tightly wound, methodical Kimball and Jones's brash, unpredictable Gerard weren't just playing cat and mouse. They were channeling the very friction that had made filming a battlefield. Still, the personal cost was undeniable. Insiders confirmed that both men left the production drained, with a respect for each other's talent but little affection. Ford, a craftsman who thrived on stability, reportedly called the role one of the most psychologically exhausting of his career, not because of stunts, but because every day felt like a war of attrition with a co-star who rejected the very notion of predictability.
I think it's a lot of fun. You know, we don't. We want people to be entertained, and it seems to be entertaining.
Jones, for his part, shrugged off the conflict with his trademark bluntness, once telling a colleague that the tension kept Harrison honest. But the unspoken truth was clear. Their creative duel had scorched the ground between them. While both men remained professional in public, insiders insist neither actor pushed for a reunion. The magic they created on screen was undeniable, but it was born of fire, and neither seemed eager to walk back into the flames. Tension simmered in subtle ways. Ford's irritation rarely exploded outward, but his clipped silences spoke volumes. Crew members noticed his jaw tighten when LaBeouf would ad-lib, dragging scenes off course, or when his restless energy disrupted the measured blocking Ford demanded.
sense knowing about me being in this, all I do is watch Indiana Jones. You know, that's all I do with my time. So I just sit around and watch the movies back to back to back to back to back to back. You have nights.
For Ford, discipline was sacred. For LaBeouf, chaos was the canvas. What was meant to be a harmonious generational handoff instead became a battle over the very definition of acting. Harrison would nail the scene in 2 takes, one insider recalled. Shia would still be pacing, still searching for something raw, something unpredictable. That didn't always mesh. The friction didn't stay confined to the set. During press for the film, LaBeouf stunned the studio by openly criticizing Crystal Skull as a creative misfire, remarks Ford reportedly took as both unprofessional and personally insulting. "I think he was a effing idiot," Ford later said bluntly, breaking his usual code of discretion. The torch-passing narrative had collapsed. Instead, the 2 actors seemed to embody an unbridgeable chasm between Hollywood traditions. LaBeouf, in later interviews, admitted the role, and Ford's stoic presence forced him into uncomfortable territory. But he never fully expressed regret. If anything, the ordeal seemed to fuel his reputation as Hollywood's enfant terrible, a storm no one could contain. Ford, on the other hand, quietly distanced himself. The veteran who had weathered creative clashes with Jones, Gibson, and others now viewed LaBeouf as a different breed altogether, less a rival than a chaotic force of nature whose volatility was antithetical to everything Ford valued.
Take to get down right there.
I'd say about 4 months, something like that.
4 months?
Yeah.
My God.
Yeah.
Did you get hurt at all doing that?
Well, it
You
wasn't a
stabbed
sharp
yourself?
blade, so I mean, the closest thing to injury was I'd flip it. Sometimes I'd be late at night, I wouldn't have my shoes on, I'd drop it on my foot or something.
The irony was almost poetic. The film was built on the image of legacy, Indy passing the whip to a younger generation. Yet behind the camera, the symbolic succession ended in ashes. Instead of forging continuity, the Ford-LaBeouf clash became another cautionary tale in Hollywood's long history of generational collision. 2 men digging for treasure in the same scene, but in opposite corners of the map. Shia LaBeouf didn't just test Harrison Ford's patience on set, he practically bulldozed through it. Known for his raw, unpredictable instincts, LaBeouf would often stay in character between takes or toss in off-script emotional flourishes that derailed carefully timed scenes. What some might romanticize as method brilliance, Ford reportedly dismissed as reckless interference.
Waiting for a good script, so we ought to thank the writers.
Okay.
The powder keg blew during what was supposed to be one of the film's emotional high points, a father-son confrontation designed to anchor the story. Instead of following the blueprint, LaBeouf started improvising lines and gestures, layering in his own chaos. Ford, a man famous for his calm professionalism, did something nearly unheard of. He shut the scene down mid-take. Crew members described the silence that followed as suffocating, the kind of tension that made even hardened veterans retreat to the sidelines. What unfolded wasn't a screaming match, but something far icier. Ford allegedly pulled LaBeouf aside and delivered a blunt lecture on collaboration, discipline, and respect for the story. Those on set would later whisper about it as a clash between Hollywood's old guard and a new breed of unpredictable talent. In post-production, Ford made his stance brutally clear to producer Frank Marshall. There's a difference between commitment to character and commitment to chaos. I won't enable the latter. It was a line that traveled quickly through industry circles, a veiled shot that branded LaBeouf as more liability than artist. By the final weeks, the damage was done. LaBeouf was often kept apart, rehearsing with the assistant director while Ford kept his distance. When LaBeouf wrapped his last scene, one crew member claimed Ford visibly relaxed for the first time in days. He looked like a man who had survived a beautiful but exhausting storm. And then came another Hollywood storm that never even made it to camera: Ford versus Kevin Costner. Among the juiciest what-ifs in film history is the unmade Western that was supposed to unite 2 of Hollywood's biggest stars. Never titled publicly, the project collapsed before cameras rolled, but its implosion has become legendary. On paper, it looked unbeatable. Ford, fresh from The Fugitive and presumed innocent, hungry to reinvent himself in a gritty Western. Costner, still riding high off Dances with Wolves, determined to craft another sweeping, self-mythologizing epic.
You know, when it came to me, it wasn't on the radar of anyone. I recognized what I thought was great writing, what it could be. And I believed so much in it that I wanted to take people on that ride.
Instead, reverence turned into rivalry. Both men wanted to be the beating heart of the story, not just on screen, but behind it. Ford envisioned a stripped-down, morally ambiguous meditation on frontier violence, full of quiet reckonings and psychological weight. Costner, he wanted another lush, sprawling epic dripping with cinematic grandeur. Each man saw the project as his ultimate Western legacy, and neither was willing to yield. What should have been a dream collaboration generation became a pissing contest. Ego outmuscled artistry, compromise evaporated, and the defining Western of a generation imploded before it ever had a chance. Insiders still whisper about it as the ultimate cautionary tale. When two stars refuse to share the sun, the whole project burns. Kevin Costner wasn't interested in subtlety. He wanted spectacle, sweeping planes, thunderous battles, and a grand tapestry of manifest destiny painted across the screen. To him, the Western was about imagery and ideals, not intimate psychology. He envisioned something closer to Lonesome Dove or How the West Was Won, a mythic saga that stretched decades. Harrison Ford, by contrast, wanted a stripped-down character study about men broken by violence and weighed down by their own moral ambiguity. Producer Lawrence Kasdan summed it up best. Harrison was chasing the psychology. Kevin was chasing the postcard they were making two different movies while pretending it was one. The script meetings quickly devolved into silent wars. Both actors began lobbying writers for changes that tilted the story in their favor. Ford demanded moments of quiet torment and moral reckoning. Costner countered with sweeping set pieces that reshaped entire plot lines just to elevate grandeur. Every draft became a territorial land grab. By the time screenwriting legend William Goldman was dragged in to salvage the wreckage, he called it a creative death spiral. Half joke, half obituary.
But it needed to stay on course. It needed to have an exact amount of time so that I could go ahead and do other things.
Things ended with a confrontation that's still whispered about in Hollywood circles. Ford, tired of watching the film morph into what he saw as shallow spectacle, openly questioned the emotional logic of Costner's character. Costner's response, delivered coolly but dripping with dismissal, became infamous. "Harrison, you're trying to turn an epic into a therapy session." That was it. The meeting ended, the partnership collapsed, and so did the film. Officially, the studio chalked it up to creative differences. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. Two egos collided, and neither was willing to take the back seat. The result? One of the greatest Westerns never made, strangled in the crib by the very stars who were supposed to make it immortal. And that wasn't the only time Harrison Ford clashed with co-stars. In fact, industry insiders have long whispered about the 6 actors Ford simply could not stand working with. So there you have it, Harrison Ford finally ripped the curtain back and named the 6 actors he hated working with the most. For decades, these stories lived in whispers, buried under red carpets, studio spin, and Hollywood PR machines. But Ford's growl cuts through all that. No sugarcoating, no diplomacy, just raw truth. To some, it's refreshing. A living legend finally telling it like it is, exposing the egos, the divas, and the so-called icons who made his career hell. To others, it's reckless. A man with nothing left to lose, torching reputations and burning bridges he doesn't need anymore. But maybe that's the point. Harrison Ford has nothing to prove, and he sure as hell doesn't care who gets offended. The bigger question is, are these really all the names? If Ford was willing to call out 6, how many more enemies are hiding in the shadows of his 5-decade career? And when those stories finally surface, the screaming matches, the backstabbing, the betrayals, will Hollywood even survive the fallout? Because if there's one thing this list proves, it's that even legends have their limits. And when Harrison Ford decides to talk, the truth is always a lot darker than the movies ever let on. So what name shocked you the most? Let us know. That's it for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.